Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar session this evening. Thank you very much for joining. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Brian McNamee, and I am the Director of the Science Foundation Ireland Centre for Research Training in Machine Learning. I'm delighted to welcome you to the panel discussion that we have this evening. We're very excited to have such an impressive panel of speakers, and I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion. Just before we get started, I wanted to let you know that the session this evening is part of the summer school that we run every year as part of the training program within our centre. Our centre is a PhD training centre. We're focused on developing training PhD students, and it's a collaboration between myself in University College Dublin and my colleagues in Dublin City University and Technological University of Dublin. We have currently over 50 PhD students in training across all areas of machine learning, and we'll be bringing another cohort of about 30 more this September. One of the things that we really focus on within the centre is the broad education of not only the technical aspects of machine learning, but all of the other questions that we should be asking around that. And we're delighted to be able to have this panel discussion this evening. So I get out of the way now, and I will hand over to our moderator, Marie Boran, who will take proceedings from here.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. And welcome everyone to our AI ethics panel, Living with AI, Should Machines Make Decisions for Us? So this is a big question, a difficult question, and certainly a loaded question. And this evening, our esteemed panelists will help us unpack all of this. But before we begin, I'd like to take a few moments to introduce our panelists. Margaret Mitchell is an industrial AI researcher. Dr. Mitchell works on algorithmic bias and fairness in machine learning. She previously headed the research ethics unit at Google, and she has now formed her own ethical AI organization. Eugenia Siapera is head of the School of Information and Communication Studies here in UCD. Professor Siapera's research interests include digital politics, data inequality, online hate speech, and AI and social justice. And one of our recent publications, co-authored with our fellow panelist, Susan Leavy, actually looks at complexity associated with defining policies for dealing with bias in AI. And next we're on to Vincent Conitzer. And Vincent is a professor at the University of Oxford and Duke University, and he's head of the Technical AI in Engagement at the Institute of Ethics in Oxford. And Professor Conitzer works on the problem of automated moral decision-making and is interested in ethical, societal, and policy aspects of AI. And finally, we have Susan Leavy, who's an assistant professor and lecturer in UCD School of Information and Communication Studies. And Dr. Levy's research interests include AI, text mining, and she's currently working on cross-disciplinary approaches to mitigating bias in machine learning algorithms. Now, before we begin, we actually have a general discussion after this, but first we're going to have each panelist introduce themselves and just talk a little bit about their work and how it relates to our big question for tonight. And so there's going to be 8 minutes or so for each panelist. And so there's going to be a gentle reminder when there's 1 minute left. Brian's going to do that. And I'm sure the attendees here with me tonight are in agreement that this is going to be a really exciting panel, and we're really looking forward to what all 4 panelists have to say. But yeah, without further ado, I'll give the floor to our first panelist, Margaret Mitchell.
Hello, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being a part of this. I should also warn everyone that I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm generally a bit incoherent before 10 a.m. my time. It's 9:37 my time, so we're gonna have a few minutes of me being incoherent. But yeah, I'm just meant to say a bit about myself, I think, right now. So I can give this background that I studied natural language processing primarily. I got my PhD in Scotland, actually looking at the generation of referring expressions to visible objects. So that's sort of like how you talk about different things you can see, how you describe them, things like that. Mixing cognitive science as well as statistics and sort of more rule-based traditional language generation. From there, I did a postdoc at Johns Hopkins where I looked at Bayesian modeling and information extraction, sort of more traditional NLP tasks. I increasingly started working in computer vision as well, sort of mixing the natural language processing and computer vision work to do things like generation of sentences and descriptions of images. From there, I started looking more and more towards the long-term goals of the work I was doing. So image captioning was popular for a while with this idea that sometime it could be helpful for people who are blind. But nobody was actually looking at what people who are blind needed, right? So you have this goal that you see in the future, but so many papers don't actually seriously consider what is needed for that goal. And so sort of with that mindset, I worked on an application for people who are blind called Seeing AI to help sort of navigate the world. And this general idea of looking towards where we want to be in the future and then figuring out specifically what we should be working on now instead of just kind of relying on others to say, like, maybe this will be useful for that, sort of formed a new way of thinking for me about my research. And so then I joined Google to work on scaling that kind of thinking across Google. And I did so well that they had to expel me, apparently. And that brings me mostly to today. I'm doing a lot of different work for a lot of different places. There's a lot of opportunities. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Margaret. And next we'll go on to Eugenia. Oh, Eugenia, you're on mute.
I was just saying that that my background is definitely not as exciting as Margaret's, and I have to admit that I feel a little bit of an imposter being here because I don't have a background in computer science. I have a background in social science with degrees in psychology, communications, and political science, and I suppose my claim here comes from my research interest in the area of social justice, especially racism, misogyny, and these kinds of like manifestations of inequality and injustice across all of society, which then become embedded in technologies and make it worse for everyone. So I suppose another aspect of my work that may be interesting to discuss is this combination of a social scientific perspective with a technological and computer science perspective. And I have worked on a research project with computer scientists to develop our own approach to content moderation and to use neural networks for identifying racist contents in social media. But the definition is not the standard definition, but it was an operationalization of definitions that came from targeted communities. So we sought to kind of like develop a system that integrates a variety of perspectives, and in particular perspectives that come from people who may be at the receiving end of racism. But it was also an occasion for me to see, and for us, for the team, to see if we could integrate different perspectives, and also the perspectives of people who are not academics or researchers themselves. They're like, I suppose, like, I don't know, normal human beings. So I think this is my background, and this is how I hope to kind of like position myself vis-a-vis these kinds of like issues and broader questions concerning technology.
Thank you very much for that, Eugenia. And Vincent, let's hear all about you.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks to everybody who put this together. Unlike Margaret, I'm on the U.S. East Coast, and I have a couple of kids upstairs who might join us at any point. So taking those two things together, I've been awake for quite a while now, which I might also be incoherent because of. But anyway, let me talk a little bit about our research, and particularly our research that's most related to the topic today, and that is automated moral decision making. This is a topic that we've been working on for a little bit over 5 years in earnest. We had an early paper, but and this is a collaboration with Walter Sinnott Armstrong, who is here at Duke in our philosophy department, and Jana Scheich-Borg, who is in our Social Science Research Institute, and a number of other wonderful students and other collaborators as well. So what do we have in mind with automated moral decision making? You can think of a couple of different types of applications. One might be self-driving cars, right? So self-driving cars are continuously making decisions. And as they do so, they have to trade off the welfare of the occupants, right, and trying to get them to where they want to go with the safety of others on the road. Driving is inherently a risky activity. And so I would argue that is already a moral problem. Other examples might include content recommendation, right? So should you show something to somebody if you realize it might radicalize them or it might contribute to polarization or anything like that, even if you know that they're likely to click that they like the item in the end. I'll also talk about the one that we've actually been working on the most is kidney exchanges. This requires a little bit of time to explain what this is. So a kidney exchange is about organ donation. So sometimes somebody's kidneys are failing and they would benefit from a transplant. One way you might get a transplant is from another person who is still alive. Because we have two kidneys, you can generally donate one and still lead a healthy life. But one problem that might come up is that you're not compatible. Like if you imagine being the patient, you might not be compatible with the person that's willing to donate to you, right? So you might have blood type A, they might have blood type B, and so you actually couldn't take their kidney. One thing that you can still do in this case is that you find another pair of people that are in the opposite situation. So maybe there the patient has blood type B and the donor has blood type A. And so the patients can actually swap their donors, if you think about it for a second, okay? And that way everybody is happy. And while it's illegal to buy and sell kidneys or to give valuable consideration for kidneys, right? I cannot say that if you give my wife a kidney, I'll give you a job. That's illegal. But swapping kidneys for kidneys is considered to be okay. What does this have to do with AI? If you now imagine getting many people in this situation together, virtually maybe, to try to figure out who should match with whom, it actually becomes a computationally difficult problem to figure out how to best do that. And so this is where AI has become involved to try to find better solutions. But then what we've been thinking about is what does it even mean to have a better solution? The simplest thing that you might say is, well, we try to match as many patients as possible. That's a great thing, but maybe in some cases you would be willing to prioritize. If one of the patients, right, so if you have to make a decision between two patients and one of them has many other health issues and probably won't live much longer anyway, and the other one is perfectly healthy, would you consider that to be a reason that you might give it to the second person? And if you go that way, then you automatically run into the question of, well, what else is it okay, or even what should you take into account and what should you not take into account? And how does this interface with the algorithm? Right, so these are not decisions that can be made by human beings directly anymore, because the algorithm has to go through this big space of all the different possibilities of how to match everybody together. And so it needs to somehow be told how to do that. So what has been our approach to that is that we try to learn from human beings, from human subjects, what are the decisions or the judgments that they would have in those kind of situations. And then we try to generalize from those, right? So if our algorithm could predict what a human being would say is the right thing to do, then the algorithm could take that decision itself as well. That's the idea. Of course, when you think about this, there's a number of issues that immediately come up. For example, most people won't agree with each other. Some people will prioritize one person, some will prioritize another person. So somehow we have to aggregate these moral judgments from different people. Another concern might be that, well, maybe you're not so optimistic about the moral judgments that people make, right? And this kind of leaves us stuck at the level of human moral judgment. So that's a real concern. I think at this point, we've settled on this approach for now, because for now, artificial intelligence doesn't have a broad understanding of the world. So it's hard to imagine it doing better than human beings in that regard. And then there are kind of more traditional machine learning concerns about, will this actually generalize well, and so on. So how might you learn this from human subjects? Some of you may be familiar with the website MIT's Moral Machine. This is a website where you can still go today. And if you go there, you'll be presented with what in philosophy are often called trolley problems, but in a kind of modern form, where a self-driving car for some reason got into the situation that it's about to run over a number of people. And the only alternative that it has is to slam into a concrete barrier and instead kill its occupants. And what should you do? And now you get to click what it should do with a detailed description of who is on the road and who is in the car. And this is a fairly controversial website, I would say. And part of the reason is that, well, the way it's presented is probably problematic in and of itself, right? So some of the characters there are, for example, a homeless person. There have been people that have thought about how do you actually take the judgments that are expressed on the moral machine, and how would you actually translate those into decisions for a self-driving car? But some of the people on the moral machine team are very opposed to that interpretation, for example, because they find in their experiments that the homeless person gets run over much more often. And so they feel that that in and of itself is evidence enough that you shouldn't do it that way. But we've been going in the kidney exchange setup, we've been trying to do something somewhat similar, but we've been trying to be a little bit more responsible about really designing it for this particular purpose, which of course the MIT moral machine team didn't have necessarily that purpose in mind. And so we think more carefully about what should be the features or the attributes of the people involved, the patients involved, that even are listed to the subject that tries to make a decision between different patients. And then from that, we try to infer what the objective function for the system should be, what it should be pursuing. And one interesting thing is that then once you have that, once you run this whole system, you can also see what kind of global effects within the system as a whole it has. And that in and of itself is interesting and maybe gives a different light on it as well. For example, one thing that we found is that people who are in a particular kind of condition, that their blood types are hard to match, right? So the donor's blood type makes it hard to give a kidney. The patient's blood type makes it hard to receive a kidney. If you do this kind of prioritization on things like age or other health considerations, then what ends up happening is if you're in that category of people who are hard to match, and on top of that, you're not highly prioritized according to age and health features, for example, then your chance of getting a kidney this way basically goes to zero. And that in and of itself seems concerning. And so we haven't quite figured out how to deal with that. So I think there are many open questions in this area, but I hope that kind of sets us up a little bit for this panel.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute there. Thank you very much, Vincent. And so we've Susan up next, and I'm interested to hear what she's going to say ahead of the topics tonight. And as with all the panelists, you can do a quick intro if you like, or we can have a little bit of explanation about your current research.
Thank you, Ray, and thanks for the invitation to partake in this panel. So what I've done is I give an intro, and I just wrote down some thoughts on the topic just to get the conversation started, perhaps. So maybe I'll go through both of those, if that suits. So for myself, my original background is English and philosophy, and that led me to artificial intelligence back in the 90s. And it was such a privileged time to study AI. It was quite different. It was like the experimental arm of philosophy at the time. And it's taken quite a change, but so I try to bring that kind of insight to the, kind of AI in the 90s, that kind of philosophy of AI that was then, to my work at the moment, I suppose. I worked for years in investment banking and went back, and I think that compounded within me a commitment to social justice and working for equality, particularly gender equality. And so I went back and studied gender studies and combined in a PhD machine learning and feminist studies in my PhD, and with a focus on natural language processing. So that's my angle. I come at this work. So in terms of the topic, I looked at should machines make decisions for us? So I'll just turn out a few thoughts on this topic. So I was thinking of this, and my short answer to this question is yes. Machines should make decisions for us if we agree and if we want them to. So I was thinking about my own life. Like I let machines make decisions for me all the time, but I do it intentionally. And I'm in the privileged position to understand the trade-offs I'm making and the limits and potential pitfalls of algorithmic decision making. I was fortunate enough to go through college and my career, and I didn't have to submit my resume to an algorithm. My grades weren't given to me by an algorithm. And that's one advantage of age, I guess, However, we're living in a world where increasingly decisions are being made by machines. And the reality is younger people, you know, their reality is quite different. They don't often have a choice. And that lack of choice and the increasing complexity and lack of transparency that goes with AI systems is an issue. Okay. And in thinking through this, in advance of this talk, I was thinking, as ever, like, when seemingly new problems occur, if we look back at history, we realize they're not so new and we've solved them in the past, perhaps. And maybe the same principles of social justice can be applied. And like, certainly if we look at human civilization, it's a history of people being embedded in cultures, societies, religions, perhaps, political systems that constantly make decisions for us. We outsource decisions all the time. And you know, often not voluntarily. We're embedded in systems and through culture, religion, or force, you know, we're not complete autonomous individuals. And the systems we outsource decisions to are neither fair, transparent, nor interpretable most of the time. So but also the very nature of living together as human beings in a community compels us to outsource decisions. So this kind of outsourcing decisions is not new. So what's different about technology making decisions for us? When we do outsource decisions to humans or to systems in general, and I'm talking particularly in the context of you know, a liberal democracy, I guess. So we expect to have a choice, trust and have an agreement, and we expect to be empowered to change the system. And we have some recourse if it goes wrong, you know, so through the democratic process, for example, there's mechanisms for change, well, technically anyway. So we have systems of accountability and a social justice system that allows us to trust strangers we've never met before and don't know anything about, you know. So these are principles that I think we need to carry over to any algorithmic decision-making system. You know, we've got to, you know, we can't trust. If you're in a system, view it as a political system, societal, cultural, economic system, as an individual or part of a group of people, if you've no power to change the system, then how can you trust it? And you've often no choice within that system. You've no pathway to recourse if things go wrong. And crucially, if you're disempowered within a system, that system is likely to be designed to reinforce that power dynamic and keep you in your place. So how can you trust? You know, you can hope that things are okay at the end, but how can you expect it to be trust that system? I don't think you can. And we've learned over history that people can't trust the systems they're in. The systems will, you know, these systems will reinforce unequal power structures. So you function within it, but with a healthy dose of skepticism, and you'll agitate for change, you know. But the odd thing, sorry, just keep an eye on time. Yeah, if the odd thing is in the context of a democratic system where you have a vote, an ability to change systems, people are probably less trusting of a government with their data than they are of technical platforms, which is to be kind of confusing, but you know, maybe it's part of protecting the power citizens have within the political system, you know, protecting what you have, or perhaps it's the subtlety of the creep of technology, and it's happening without full awareness and agreement in society. So I go back to the question, should people outsource decisions? Can people trust technology to make decisions? And my own answer is, at present, no, they're not empowered sufficiently, you know, except in highly regulated contexts. Because the basic principles to enable our trust in other contexts is not there. Things like regulation, systems of accountability, or just through ability to, you know, to add societal pressure. It's the central issue. And so my answer is probably yes, in an ideal world we can trust systems, but we need a lot of improvements, things like regulation, standards, governance, transparency, accountability, but education, awareness. We've done it before in other contexts, and we've got to in a hurry. The issue with technology is the pace of change. Like, we're really in a race, because the proliferation of technology, society can change before nearly the pressure builds up for demand for change. So yeah, that's my thoughts over this topic.
Thank you, Susan. There is a lot that we could unpack there. And I think, but what has caught my attention is you've essentially said it's not the AI, it's society and how AI operates within it and gets applied. So maybe that's a big question to ask, but how do we make sure that AI doesn't amplify societal injustice? And I think I'm going to actually I'm going to see what Eugenia's thoughts are on that. How do we design AI, or design the people who work in AI? How do we make sure that it doesn't amplify all of these biases that we already experience outside of technology itself?
Thanks, Marie. I actually had a little bit of a speech going that I didn't get to deliver because I got confused, like Margaret, thinking that we were first going to do an introduction about ourselves and then respond to the question. But my speech, which I'm not going to give, so that you can relax, I'm not going to give it now. But that's my big reflection on the question: should machines make decisions for us? Was an unpacking of who is us. And who develops the machines who are going to make the decision for us. So if we begin with on the assumption that of course we want to talk on behalf of humanity, but humanity in the present time is very unequally structured. So it's very difficult to develop machines to speak for all of us. So we have to understand, when we develop a system, that some people are left outside, some people are harmed, some people are benefit more by these systems. I also want to very briefly reflect on who develops these machines, and to make it more concrete. It seems to me that at the moment, the capabilities for developing artificial intelligence systems of any kind of like scale and bite are down to private corporations. So to me, this is extremely problematic. And I'm not sure that there is any regulation in place that can force them, or the appetite for any regulation that can force them to address questions of social justice. It's entirely voluntary at the moment, and it's couched in an abstract language of ethics. So I will just leave it here, because I'm pretty sure that other panelists have a lot of things to say. For me, it's at the moment very difficult to see how these technologies and these kinds of systems developed in this present context by private corporations who operate for profit will address or will resolve questions of social justice.
Excellent. And Margaret, if I could actually ask you the same question, because I think it's one that probably all the panelists have lots of thoughts on, but how do we ensure that AI is developed in such a way that it doesn't amplify current social injustices?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of like one of the core problems of developing ethical AI.
The big one you want to solve.
Yeah, if only we could solve it very easily. I think my thoughts are quite similar to Eugenia's. And I think I want to take a step back from that question a bit to speak to how it's difficult to answer more general questions about trends when you aren't having access to the specific contexts where a system is being used, the specific people who are using it, the specific people who have developed it, just sort of similar to what Eugenia has said. And so while I can think of situations where if you can identify the specific kinds of social injustices that you want to make sure that a system doesn't replicate, you could work on methods to address that directly based on how the system is going to be used in context. So, I mean, just for my own work, it's, I focus on things like racism and sexism specifically, and in things like computer vision systems and natural language processing systems. And in that context, we actually have a clear list of at least some of the characteristics that we want to make sure the system does well or equal across. So different kinds of genders, different kind of skin tones, this sort of thing. And this is actually another area where sociologists and social scientists are quite helpful, because they can provide the information about what are we looking for in these systems that we need to address directly. I think computer scientists in general in AI, there's this sort of sense that you can't know about people, or it doesn't matter what people say, and things sort of are all automated. But actually, when you're talking about not amplifying social injustices, you have to have a deep understanding of what those social injustices are in order to directly get them head on. So, I mean, just kind of going back to the racism and sexism example, it's a misunderstanding that people have that it's impossible to know all the various characteristics in which people will be discriminated against. But actually, we do know a lot of them, and we can list them, right? So we see this in various civil rights acts. So, you know, in the US, it's race, gender, sexual orientation, colors in the 64 Act, age, I think ability status came around in the 90s. So there are specific sets that we know from people who study society are these characteristics that are most likely to suffer from discriminatory treatment. And once we have those, we can design systems with that you know, in mind in order to sort of best address. So speaking to something like general social injustice, and then taking it to like a specific application, you can think of, for example, face detection, where there are situations where it could propagate social injustice, for example, if it's only recognizing people of a certain color and giving them opportunities that other people don't have, basically further amplifying, you know, stratified aspects of society. And so that's something that leads to social injustice. And in that sort of case, that sort of context, you would want to work on making sure that the system worked well across different subpopulations. But again, it also depends on how it's being used and what the context is. So you might want to set other kinds of constraints. So yeah, to just sort of quickly summarize what I said, context really matters. But in specific contexts, I think we are getting closer and closer to mitigating specific kinds of aspects that lead to social injustice.
And just to further add to that, I'm wondering, do you think, is it mostly, how would you stack it for intentional versus unintentional biases? Because they can, you know, unintentional bias being there are more white males working in computer science before it was recognized that that's a problem and diversity is needed. They unintentionally built systems that were better at recognizing male faces and white faces. So do you think that we have got to a point now where there's known knowns that we know for a fact that if diversity is a problem, we can tackle that, and it's not going to be, oops, we didn't realize that was a problem. Have we recognized all of the problems that we need to recognize?
Not well. I mean, I think there's a little bit of a problem of just a bubble within people who work on ethics. Like, I am continually amazed working in tech by how much people aren't even thinking of. Whereas, you know, when you work in this area, you're like, of course, if we release a dermatology app, we'll make sure that it works great across different skin tones. You know, you can list all the potential negative outcomes of doing a false positive or a false negative based on, you know, different skin tones, or, you know, false positives being more common for some skin tone. And so if everyone had a similar awareness and mindset, which seems like should be obvious when you work on this stuff, then we perhaps would be progressing on this much better. But people just don't care outside, you know, like that's kind of why this area has a relatively small amount of experts, because a lot of people just don't care. They want someone else to think about it. and then they might not even incorporate what that person thinks. And so, you know, just a couple weeks ago, we saw a dermatology app release that only worked for white skin. And it's just like, really? Like, you're still at step one? So although there's potentially a future where we could be getting better at addressing these kinds of issues, we are not at all there yet. And it's a lot to do with culture as opposed to the systems.
Thank you very much, Margaret. That's a really great answer. And Vincent, I'm going to take that one to you. We won't trot the same questions around, continue to all the panelists, but I think that one is important to ask you as well, that about societal injustices. How do we make sure that AI doesn't amplify?
This is to me, right? Yes.
Yeah, Vincent.
Yeah, so I mean, it's already been covered very well. I just wanted to just also give a concrete example, because I think sometimes people don't really realize how, for example, not being recognized by a facial recognition system even really results in a disadvantage. And I think there was a good example of that during the pandemic. I didn't have direct access to the system or anything, but I just read this in the news. But there was this example where people in the US were taking the bar exam in some states, and due to the pandemic, they had to take it online. And now what they did, and this is a high stakes exam, this is going to determine their future as lawyers. And the way that they had it work was that if you were taking the bar exam online, you had to be in front of your camera, and the camera and an algorithm behind the scenes was checking that it was still you in front of the computer taking the bar exam. And wouldn't you know it, this worked much more poorly on darker skinned people, who as a result had to shine bright lights in their face while they're taking the exam in order to still be recognized by this software. Now, I don't know about you, but like, I don't really like to take exams with bright lights shining in my face. I think I'm going to do worse. I don't think that's going to be fair. So that just as a concrete example of what Margaret was already saying. I do worry about there being additional biases that we haven't that aren't on our radar, right? While agreeing with Margaret that even the most obvious ones still sometimes get left behind, there might be other ones. And I don't know if to some extent, I guess that will require further research just at a societal scale, what's happening there, but also on the specific applications, I think, right? What's a good way to identify if a particular system has some bias that's maybe not one of the standard biases that we usually think about, but that's still one to be concerned about. I don't know exactly what the answer to that would be, but I think that's an important problem.
Great, excellent. And so we have talked about really concrete examples of how AI can make decisions for us, like something like I guess the biggest one would be the driverless car example, that it's just completely taking over the process of driving for us. But what about what I suppose you would term soft decision making? And I know, Vincent, you'd mentioned this a little bit. You talked about some content recommendation systems. So I'd like to ask the panelists, and maybe I'll start with you, Vincent, because we're just on you right now. But is this a bigger problem in the sense that it's so pervasive, and in the fact that we're nudged towards what content we consume, where Spotify nudges us to a playlist, YouTube nudges us to content that might be polarizing or even extremist, and everything we use is these are all essentially soft decisions that as Cass Sunstein would say, we're nudged constantly in these directions. Is this more insidious because it's nudging and not outright making a decision for us?
Yeah, I think to some extent that's right? So I tend to keep a broad view of what a decision is, right? So I think the algorithm decides to put a particular piece of content in front of me. That's already a decision, even though at some other level, the decision of whether to finally watch it, yes, that is up to me. But I think it's a good illustration of how just having a human in the loop doesn't always solve the problem, right? The fact that I can refuse to watch this one piece of content that's being put in front of me probably isn't going to make a whole lot of difference, because if that's the one thing that's in front of me, I'm going to watch it anyway. And moreover, right, overall, the system might be doing quite well at recommending pieces of content to me that I like, right? That's what it's to some extent intended to do. So I might enjoy using it, and I might give it a little bit of credit, even if there's something that looks like I might not really enjoy it. Based on its track record, maybe I'll give it the benefit of the doubt. But the effects of that might be much broader ranging. It might change me. As it changes me, like as it radicalizes people in the population or polarizes them, that has what in economics we call an externality on the rest of society as well, right? That's everybody suffers to some extent from being in a polarized society. So I think that's exactly right, that it is a little bit insidious. On the one hand, it seems to be a very low stakes decision. And that's also, it's low stakes, and there are very many of them. And that's exactly the kind of situation where you do want to there is a big incentive to let AI take the role of making the decision completely, rather than having a human in the loop, right? So why would you ever let an algorithm make some decision that has some moral components? And I guess there can be multiple reasons. One might be one of speed. If you're thinking about a self-driving car, those decisions have to be made very fast. And to me, I don't think a self-driving car is going to be particularly useful until I really get to sit back and not pay attention to the road. If I have to pay attention constantly anyway, because I have to be able to take over at any point, I'd rather just be driving myself, because that way at least I force myself to pay attention. Right. So that's, yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. And you mentioned human in the loop, and that's something that some of the attendees might not know, that phrase that a lot of AI researchers and AI ethicists talk about. And so this is throwing this out to anyone on the panel that wants to talk a little bit about the importance of having a human in the loop when you're designing an AI system, and if it's ever okay to not have a human in the loop. So if anybody wants to take that, or I can just pick someone randomly if you have any thoughts.
I'll come in on that.
Susan, lovely.
I guess I think there's an awful lot of aspects, and linking on from what Vincent was talking about recommender systems. If you think of that as a case for human in the loop, this humans should be everywhere, but it depends on if you think of the user perspective. It's a very privileged position to be able to critique algorithms, know kind of how they work, and know their potential pitfalls. But children, for example, consuming being recommended stuff on YouTube or through recommender systems, they don't know, and it's increasingly powerful in their lives. So where is the human in the loop protecting them, I guess? So there should be human in terms of regulation. When systems are being trained, it's not just humans, it's social scientists need to be all over how they're trained, how they're curated, the concepts of how humans are represented in the data, the classification systems, the labeling, not just any people who are trained, ethicists, social scientists, have to be all over this process, I think.
And what about the idea of the big red button? And that's talked about a lot in terms of driverless cars, that there always should be a big red button that a person can slam on and go, I do not want a robot, or I don't want an AI system making this decision for me. Stop and throw the robot out. Again, to anyone that wants to talk about that idea of the big red button in automation and AI.
I'm all for big red buttons everywhere. Yeah.
That may be a good idea, but I think it wouldn't solve all of the problems, right? Because we still would get so many benefits from these systems, right? Maybe I still enjoy my self-driving car. I still enjoy content being recommended to me. And a lot of these applications could be very valuable as well, right? We can think about online education. I think certainly the companies and people behind massive open online courses like this idea that if I'm taking a course online, if I'm trying to learn something, the AI system maybe can recognize what it is that I'm currently not yet understanding and recommend exactly the right piece of content for me that will help clear up my understanding and move me along in the course, right? And that seems to be a wonderful application. Of course, even there, we want to be concerned about biases and other things. But in principle, that's a wonderful application. And while we might prefer a world where there were just more teachers available, I would prefer such a world. I would love for us to spend more money on early childhood education and many other things. But the fact is that unfortunately there isn't enough. And so those systems in principle could have some very beneficial effects. And that would very much rely on a human not being in the loop, because the problem is that there aren't enough well-trained humans to do that teaching job. So I think being able to refuse an AI system's help can be a good idea, but in so many cases we'll perceive some immediate benefit from using the AI system that by itself is certainly not going to solve all our problems.
May I? Oh, Eugenia.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in there, because I take a slightly different position to that of Vincent in this matter, because I think that that this refusal at the individual level may not be good enough. I think we have the right to refuse systems at the level of community or society. I also would probably disagree with you that, oh, well, unfortunately, there is no money for teachers, but there is a lot of money to experiment with technologies. So I think that we have to maybe think about this more carefully. Also, in the speech that I didn't give, I was thinking about what is the for in the for us, make decisions for us. And I think that that kind of discussion brings us to this question, because on the one hand, these decisions are replacing us, but on the other hand, they're providing a service to us. So we have to think of this, both these elements. What exactly, who are they replacing and who are they servicing, and in what way, and whether we want to outsource cognitive and emotional labor to machines. So I think these are fundamental questions, and I'm not sure that being able to refuse them at an individual level is enough. So that is my kind of like slight deviation from Vincent's.
I kind of want to make a bit of a tangential point, and that has more to do with getting on the sort of same page about what we're talking about. Because coming from a computer science perspective, human in the loop has generally meant to me that it's a train time aspect. So human in the loop is, for example, you're grabbing data, you're seeing how the model is performing, and then you realize, oh, it needs more of this kind of data. This is sort of an active human in the loop training paradigm. And that's generally how I learned what that term meant. But working in sort of the ethics sphere more, human in the loop now also means that there is someone at the final decision ends. So not the training, but the deployment. And within deployment, there's still a few kinds of ways that human in the loop is used. One way is that there's a human that comes in within a pipeline and helps adjust things before some final output is given. And then the other way is that the final output is given and then a human does something. And I would argue that's not in a loop, that's human at the end or something, human at the line. So I think that I just want to make sure that we're sort of clear that there are different considerations for when humans are coming in and adjusting parts of the pipeline, and when humans are acting directly on an output. And these are sort of two kinds of ways that human in the loop is made. And so I just sort of want to clarify, I think based on both what Eugenia and Vincent are saying, that there's a lot of concern right now around this final decision thing, if humans should be able to override it, if they should be able to, take it into account only a little bit. And I think that's where a lot of the concern is lying. But then within the sort of pipeline aspect, where people come in within an overall pipeline, it's less clear where the concerns there lie. And I don't know that a lot of work has been done on that, actually. Maybe Vincent and Eugenia and Susan know more. So I just kind of wanted to clarify that my head has been going a few different ways by this question. And so I think we're all talking about the end point maybe.
Yeah, there's different. Yeah, there's a kind of a working definition, I suppose, in ethics that you say in the loop, but you do mean at the. It does mean at the end of the line. It actually is the big red button.
The big red button.
Yeah.
So that's a different kind of so that's a different kind of issue, because then you're dealing with automation bias really heavily, which means that when you have an output from a system, you tend to think that it's right, even in the face of other evidence that's clearly well motivated. So the difference between an expert telling you that this is cancer versus a system telling you that this is cancer, you actually have a tendency to believe a system. There's a sense that it's objective and neutral, and so it can't be, making problematic decisions. And I think that one of the key issues within the human at the end sort of thing is that although it'd be great to have some sort of red button or whatever it is, in practice, humans aren't very good at making decisions based on an output. Once they've seen that output, they tend to be more biased to accept it. So it's another sort of aspect of this.
I think that's exactly right. I would say that, so I completely agree, like, putting a human on one individual decision in the position of having to override the algorithm, that's a very difficult position to put somebody in. I think maybe the better role for humans after deployment, and this is maybe still in a kind of loop, is to keep inspecting the system after deployment, right? Because some things will only show up after deployment. Some things will shift over time, that the world changes and the system is no longer working the way that it was working before, or maybe somebody is deploying it in a different context and didn't really think about retraining it. That's one way that I think after deployment, we really still want to have humans in the loop, because then hopefully it feeds back.
Yeah, continuous monitoring. Absolutely. That's a critical aspect. I think so too.
And just speaking of these humans sorry, Eugenia, go ahead.
No, I think like maybe I don't understand this very, very well, but for me, it's fundamental to have the possibility of overriding an automated system, especially when the decision it takes affects the rest of your life. For example, I'm thinking of the deployment of artificial intelligence systems for welfare decisions. So you sit there, you just see a computer, and the computer says, no, you're not entitled to this benefit, you're not entitled to that benefit. And there's no one that can take into account the specifics of your situation, override the system, and make a decision to help you. I think that it is fundamental that people are entitled to appeal to a human rather than to appeal to a machine. So I don't know, maybe we need to make a distinction there in terms of the decisions that override is fundamental, and decisions that maybe it's something that is counterproductive.
I think there's also a question. Oh, Susan, go. You have.
No, I was just going to agree with Eugenia saying I think choice is fundamental to trust. You cannot, if you've no choice but to comply with someone else's decision, or you can't, that autonomy and freedom is taken away from you. So I think it's a fundamental part of building trust in automated systems, is that option is there.
Yeah, I totally agree with that too. I did want to take some slight objection to Eugenia's point, and that's specifically because I was thinking a lot about when would be a situation where you don't want humans to be able to override an automated decision. I think that's because it was part of the sort of thoughts of putting together this panel. And so once I started thinking about it a lot, I realized that there might be situations where there are specific people who are not the right people, who are not the experts, right? Who are not good to be making this decision and not good to be making the override decision. So you can think of situations where people are particularly cruel or particularly discriminatory, or just much less well-trained compared to a system. And maybe in those situations, you don't want to give them the power to override, because in general, those will be worse decisions. But that's different than being able to appeal to some human, appeal to some expert, appeal to someone who can see the larger landscape. And that's where, humans coming in and being able to override really matters. So I think there are situations where you don't want humans to be able to override it, but it's specific situations where the human is not going to make a good decision. And so overall, it might be better. But having humans more generally, like there is an expert that you can appeal to. Yeah, clearly that's critically important. Especially
that's actually the argument for automation in this new book I called Noise. It's co-authored by Cass Sunstein. Is that noise being human decisions and what humans determine to be A or B? It's all scattershot or noise, and they give the analogy of having a target, and when humans make decisions, bias is where all the arrows go to the exact same point, but they're to the right of the correct decision, and noise being it's all over the place. And they gave examples of humans being messy humans, and judges making decisions on cases, and they found that for the same crime, one judge could give someone 8 months, and the other gives them 5 years. And they're saying this is where AI-driven automation is a good idea, that we humans can make messy decisions that they're not always fair, quote unquote. So are these the use cases? I'm not saying throw out judges, but how do we navigate this landscape? How do we make sure that we do have humans there to appeal to, but also make sure that that noise might be eliminated, because that would make for maybe a juster society? Sorry, it's a big question.
Go, Susan.
I was going to go on a bit of a tangent, so I think, okay, I'll go with my tangent, see where it leads us. So that made me think of, say, artificial intelligence, the AI, say in the 90s when I studied it, and it was philosophy, and it was about simulating the human intelligence. It was like an aspiration. Can we simulate human intelligence? So that was our model, that was our benchmark. It wasn't perfection by any means, but it turns out these techniques that were developed as part of this aspiration became really useful in certain narrow specific tasks, but they weren't like from the get-go designed to be like humans are flawed, our intelligence is not perfect, and it's designed to simulate that. So it requires kind of a rethink, I guess, if we're taking these techniques that were to simulate something really flawed and do something better. It's not artificial intelligence anymore. It's another thing nearly, that requires a different philosophy, perhaps, different theory of mind.
Yeah.
Tangent.
Sorry. So yeah, I mean, I guess somewhat piggybacking off of that, but also going back to the previous thoughts too. Well, first off, I want to say that I've heard this humans are noisy thing a lot, and I've had like pretty serious fights with people, or debates with people about this, because the idea that humans make noise is another way of thinking about the idea that humans have a lot of variance. And if you're really thinking about how to model humans and how humans behave and capturing something like humanity, then I see, humans make all kinds of decisions, and that's part of being human. That's not noise. The noise thing, I think, comes from the idea of like Gaussian distributions, or, very like computer science mathematical ideas. And so, I would debate with people in computer vision who would say like, humans don't tend to say, yellow for yellow banana, and that's noisy. And I'd say, no, that's a specific kind of bias, reporting bias. This is a human behavior. So I tend to sort of push back against the idea that humans are noisy, because there's something else, like they have high variance, reflecting different kinds of experiences. So in the high variance case, like the example, Marie, you gave of shooting, and hitting the center, being slightly off, or two judges giving very different times for incarceration or something like that, I don't think it's the case that an automated system would make that better, because it is still going to be reflecting some kind of bias, and it will be doing it consistently and at scale. And so say one judge says this person should be in jail for 1 month. Another judge says this person should be in jail for 5 years. if a system comes in and says, you know, somewhere in between or something, that doesn't mean it's right or better. It could be the case that the first judge, the 1-year judge, or that person is more right. But it is it is not the case that that a system will be able to have that similar kind of variance and discussion that's I think necessary to arrive at those kinds of, you know, life critical decisions. And further, these systems that people develop to make these kinds of decisions are proliferated, are propagated throughout the world, you know, some of the same models, which means that the exact same mistake is being made again and again and again. It's consistent errors, which is also hugely problematic when there are specific kinds of biases. So I would sort of push against the idea that if there is a high variance in humans, a system is better. I would say that if there's a high variance, a system can put forth another hypothesis of what to do, but that is not based on the overall considerations of what the specific context is. And I think it was to Susan's point, we've learned these kinds of lessons before in the past. So there was this huge movement about mathematical models in the justice system in the 70s. And basically, at least in the US, I'm not sure about outside of that, but you know, eventually they came to the decision that it was impossible to model every single factor at play in each case. So they abandoned mathematical models, and everyone's sort of forgotten that. I mean, to Susan's point, people are not so great at learning from the past in different fields. But we do know from this past and from the legal field that this has been a problem before. So sort of relying on deep learning or machine learned models just because they learn from a lot more data doesn't mean that they're able to capture the specific factors of each specific situation. And so while they can be a signal for a consideration, they shouldn't be the deciding factor.
So maybe just to build on that, I think that there are some situations where we prefer to have a clear policy, right? And law is maybe to some extent like, you know, we do have sentencing guidelines, but maybe also we feel that there needs to be some leeway. But in other contexts, you might be concerned not only about human mistakes, but even about things like corruption, right? So if this person now has the opportunity to override the algorithm and drastically change your life, but they're also in a position that they can, you know, force you to pay them something on the side for that, that might be the kind of case where you really want to just stick with the system, right? And that to me, that feels kind of this, you know, even if there isn't AI involved, those are the kinds of situations where we like to have a clear policy, right? And to the extent that the AI system is transparent enough what it's doing, it's not really, in my view, all that different from having a clear policy, right? So Margaret, would you agree with that? That's, you know, that those tend to be the cases where maybe we don't want to allow the AI system to be overruled, where we also wouldn't want the policy to be overruled?
Yeah, so I guess I'm not sure I agree, because I'm struggling with the difference between what is generally meant when people say AI, which is closer to machine learning and deep learning, which is not rule-based, as opposed to having a policy, which tends to be more rule-based. So in a broad view of AI, where AI is anything that produces a value, which, you know, it's coming to mean like your remote control is an AI, then I would agree with you, where it could model an actual policy. But in use, when people are like talking about AI coming in, they're not including these sort of rule-based, you know, reasoned out sort of decisions. It's more to do with learning patterns from data without being told. And so in those cases, and I think this was maybe also to Susan's point about the difficulty of explainability and interpretability, where it doesn't have a policy per se, it has something and we don't quite know what it is, then it's probably more problematic. So I agree with you in a broad sense of AI where you can have specific policies. I disagree in a more narrow sense of AI where it's deep learning and we're not very clear on what it's learned.
I was thinking more along the lines of my colleague Cynthia Rudin here at Duke works on interpretable machine learning. So it's still machine learning, it's looking at the data, but then the classifier that it outputs is very rule-based, right? That's, you can actually inspect it, look at it and say, well, it says like, if age is above this, then do this, otherwise do this, right? So that was more the kind of thing that I had in mind, that, you know, even though that's learned from data, you can inspect the final output as a classifier and say, well, this is something I'm willing to go along with.
Yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah, when you can see a specific policy and agree that this is the policy, then yeah, that's really useful.
But I also agree that many people don't have something like that in mind when they talk about AI, so, unfortunately.
I'd like to ask a question about transparency, because that's been brought up several times by nearly all of the panelists. But how do we ensure that, how do we make sure that transparency is something that non-expert publics can take part in? How do we make sure there's enough public discourse on this? And like, do we just invite members of the public in and get them to see how it's working? But like, how would you tackle this problem of making sure that it's transparent, not just for other machine learning researchers or people within a company, but for everyone, for members of the general public? And I'll just start with maybe Eugenia, if you have any thoughts on that. What does this kind of transparency look like to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. And my standard position is to be very critical towards transparency, because what is it there for? And most of the times, the reference to transparency is because people want to kind of like use it as a proxy for something else. So it's never transparency for its own sake, but it is because it's taken to mean something else. So we have to, like, okay, if we understand transparency from the point of view of how was this decision made, and how fair is this decision, or how fair is the system that makes a decision, then I suppose we would need something like an approach that audits what went in and what came out, and how this system was put together. So it's a slightly different thing than transparency. I'm also coming to this from the point of view of someone who has spent a lot of time recently going through Facebook's transparency reports when it comes to how they use artificial intelligence for monitoring of hate speech and misinformation. And I can tell you that I'm none the wiser, to be honest. So a lot can be hidden in transparency reports, even as they pretend to be. I don't see that they pretend to be, they try to be transparent. It's just that it's like, I suppose this story by Edgar Allan Poe, the Purloined Letter, that, you know, things are hidden in plain sight. So so I suppose this is my view about transparency. First is that we have to be very clear what it is that we want transparency to do, and secondly, then to maybe develop systems that address the specifics rather than a system that may comprehensively address questions of transparency.
And that's a very good point. You're asking, what does transparency mean, and what is it a proxy for? So does transparency mean, here's how the system works, do you understand it? Or it could be, here's what data we're taking from you and how it's used. Or here's where the decision making is happening. You know, this algorithm has given you these videos because you were interested in that, because you watched that video of David Attenborough, but also we happen to have we shook hands with some third-party vendors, and we also know that you bought his DVD on Amazon. I mean, you know that you subscribe to it. So there's a lot of extra information that you have to pull in there. And I'm sure even at the point of whoever's delivering these services, be it YouTube or whatever, there's never one person, is there, that knows all of the factors that go into a decision that's made. And so has anybody got any thoughts on that? How can one person even understand the complexities and the data points that bring us to this decision that has been made? Like, here's a David Attenborough video.
I would wonder if in all cases it's really necessary that the end user, that it's transparent to the end user. Certainly it would be nice, and it would certainly have additional benefits. But I think many of the benefits would already come from it being broadly inspectable by, let's say, the broader AI community, if they are inclined to do so, right? Maybe you can compare this to like terms of service on a website, right? I don't know how you are, but sometimes you start to use the service and there's this long legal document of terms of service, and maybe I try to read the first few paragraphs and I decide I don't understand the legal gobbledygook and I just agree, right? But one thing that I sometimes do is, if somebody is changing their terms of service, I go look in the news to see if somebody is complaining about the fact that they've changed the terms of service, because I figure maybe there's somebody out there that really is inclined to read the full terms of service. And if there's something particularly bad in there, maybe they would, at least raise that and it would come out into the news. So I wonder, while again, of course, it'd be better if I could understand the terms of service directly. And certainly, I myself have benefited even from just simple things like on Amazon, it recommends this product because I bought this other product before. Right. And sometimes that's helped me that like, oh, now I know why it's recommending that, but that actually doesn't make sense. But okay, now at least I know what happened. But I think a lot of the value would already come from, even if it's not understandable, if it's released in a way that it's understandable to some specific people who are not affiliated with the company that's producing the system, and that maybe are inclined or incentivized to actually inspect the system, that could create broader societal trust if you believed in this whole mechanism. Whether we have enough of that out there, I mean, we have academia, and some of us in academia try to inspect some of these systems. Maybe I don't think there is enough of that yet, right? I don't know if, to some extent, I like the gender shades work that you might be familiar with, that was inspecting facial recognition software, particularly that was doing gender classification. They figured out that it worked much better on white males, maybe unsurprisingly, given the general trend of most of these things, than on, for example, Black females. But that was an interesting type of research. I thought in some sense the most interesting thing, and it was an important paper in and of itself, but the kind of research that was doing, I thought was particularly interesting. Because it's sort of bordering on a very technical kind of investigative journalism, right? And trying to figure out how these systems really work. And if we had more transparency about how the systems work, then that kind of investigative journalism, or something that's kind of between investigative journalism and research, could really take off and help us as a society really trust these systems as well.
I want to jump in because I'm so excited. So I want to just that.
Go ahead, Margaret.
So you basically just described this project I've been working on called model cards. And the idea with model cards is, A, you have disaggregated evaluation, which is in gender shades. And that's a kind of auditing, a kind of probing, sort of as you're saying, where you look at how this performs for different genders, for different skin tones. And then that gives you some sense of how the model is working. That's the evaluation part of it when it's done, and doing it in a disaggregated way really helps tease out the differences there. And that's one aspect of what should go into a model card. And then the other thing that you mentioned, where you want to understand why it was being developed and things like that, having like a terms of service, that's the other part of the model card, where you have the intended users, the limitations, the well, not benefits, but details about how to use the system, all those kinds of factors, like you have in a terms and service, except more like nutrition facts to make it sort of smaller and readable. That is a massive project that I've been working on, and I'm so excited that you said all that, because I completely agree, and that work is happening. Yeah, I think it's a great way to go. And also to Eugenia's point, there also are a lot of very cool and also difficult interpretability techniques you can do, but you could imagine that actually also coming into some sort of interactive model card, or like an interactive terms of service, where you can play around with different variables and then see how, what it's seeing and what it can tell you in an interpretability sort of way changes. And then this also goes on to a tangent about counterfactuals, but I won't go into that tangent other than to mention that they're relevant. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Margaret. That sounds like a really interesting project, and I love your enthusiasm about it. It looks like it would go away towards solving some of the problems we've been talking about. And I think two of the biggest problems in terms of machine learning and training data sets to get these outputs that we hope would be fair, like we've given the examples of computer vision where it will recognize white male faces, but not so much maybe black female faces. So if we get rid of this whole garbage in, garbage out, as it's called often, where it's just a bad data set, or bad, not necessarily just incomplete, or whatever it may be, or dirty data. And we've talked about data being used in the justice system, especially where it might be, it's used as a score for somebody, will they reoffend or not? And they're given a score for predicting if they'll reoffend. And we know this is referred to as dirty data because it could be that we've talked about proxies as well. Eugenia had mentioned that maybe the proxy for reoffending is just how many arrests were made in this area, or how many, and the arrest could be made because cops are patrolling an area because there is a bit of racial bias going on there. So if we magically get rid of that dirty data, and we make sure that there's no more garbage in, garbage out, is it plain sailing? Or are we just happy to lie back and let AI automate everything? Eugenia is shaking her head. Let's hear what you say, Eugenia.
Okay, I will start, and then Susan and I have been thinking about this for some time now, but I will start by saying that if only it were that simple. Some systems are just beyond salvation, no matter how good the training data are meant to be. I think this is what we have to keep in mind to begin with, but also the fact that when we say curating data, what exactly do we mean? When we say cleaning data, what exactly do we mean? So all these are like very unspecific things that require a lot of thought and a lot of effort, and a lot of engagement with stakeholders, because that's something that I think computer scientists are missing a lot. I think that that a lot of the times, like, humans in specific communities are delegated to like ground truth, but someone's version of ground truth, not reality. So I think I want to stop here, and maybe Susan can expand a lot more on this topic because it's directly her area.
The topic, well, I've lost my train of thought a little bit there. I'm still thinking about, so the data and the transparency. I just want to comment back on the transparency, if I can go back a little bit and just and mention the EU regulations that are the EU proposed regulations for AI, and I think that they're really important in that sense. And like how working out the implementation, but it really focuses on transparency and calls for, if I look at the quote here, sufficiently for high-risk systems, which is problematic perhaps in defining what's high risk, because we only know after the fact what's high risk, after the damage has been done. But they call for sufficient, that systems are sufficiently transparent to enable users to understand and control high-risk AI system, how high AI risk systems produce their output. So I think we'll see big changes in that area. So in the data, what's the question again? Bias in and bias out in terms of data.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot I was muted there. So yeah, Susan, that's what I was asking Eugenia. I'm forgetting myself at this stage of the evening. So we're talking about the idea of garbage in, garbage out, and dirty data. And if we somehow have this green data set that machine learning trains itself on, that the algorithm is getting quote unquote perfect data, pure data, perfect data, whatever that means, but it's getting just the right amount of data, that it's okay to just sit back and let our world get more increasingly automated.
Okay, yeah, sorry, yeah, I could go on about this. I suppose it's complex, and I think it's complex because no matter what data you collect and curate, it's always going to be written from a perspective, and it embodies a philosophical world view, and it's going to have a standpoint. And that's okay, that's data, but there's got to be transparency into who collated the data, who's represented within it, you know, what values it reflects. Kind of really, it really needs to be critically analysed. And also, you can have a system that uses biased data, and depending on the system, it doesn't matter. It depends on what features it's looking at in that data set. You can add, there are techniques to de-bias data. That helps. All these interventions help, you know, but I do think a whole new approach to curating data and involvement with it of social scientists is crucial in that space. So improve things. We certainly can't ever sit back because, you know, the world changes too fast. There'll never be a data set that represents kind of where we, because machine learning will take a picture of reality and perpetuate that, say, to simplify it. So whereas we might learn patterns, but we have a vision of where we want to go. And Eugenia and I spoke before about a data utopianism. You know, so how do you, we make decisions, but we're aware of our own biases, but we also have a vision of the ideal and what's good and what's bad. So ethics comes into it, but also maybe you could curate a data set for where we want to be in the future, not where a result of a flawed past, you know, so yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Susan. And I'm actually now going to start looking through some of the questions because we've got a lot of questions from our attendees. Thank you very much, everyone. And Brian has carefully curated as our human curator. This is not an AI doing it. Brian has carefully selected some choice cuts of questions for us. So I'll kick off and ask a few of these. So this is actually from an anonymous attendee. In the future, as AI improves, when we make decisions that can be influenced by personal biases, would it not be wiser to listen to the AI because the AI would be able to make a decision that's based on the utility of the decision rather than containing some emotional factor in the decision making? And I think that's probably Spock. It's an anonymous person, but they think we should render, just cut off all of the silly, useless emotion and just get right to the decision making. Anyone want to grab that one and run with it? It's a really interesting question.
I can speak if I really like this question because there's an application of AI where it is to correct human biases. And I see this as a really cool way to go. So one example where this would be so helpful is in when women are analyzed in sort of performance reviews for raises and promotions and these sorts of things. There are some very clearly documented biases, not only in the specific language that's used. So, you know, the difference between saying, I don't know, the difference is like gentle, like words like gentle, you know, tend to be used for women, but not for men, even if they are. And also things like physical characteristics, like smiling. I got this in my performance reviews, like keep up the smiling. I don't think men probably get that, right? And then there's also just the kind of information given, like it's super common that women are criticized for having communication difficulties without it being very clear like how they are supposed to be fixing that, and it's just always shifting, right? And so you can imagine an AI application, and there's been work on this, where when you write a performance review, it, you know, collects chunks of text and says, this is a very gendered thing to say. Do you want to rethink this? Or maybe do you even want to rewrite this? Because there's like corresponding terms for men and women that tend to be used in these things. Like I know there's like has great leadership for men can be like very aggressive and bossy for women, right? So these are things that like are realized differently depending on gender. And you can imagine a system that really highlights that, like, you are very much messing this up. Let me show you how, and we can fix it. I think that's such a cool area to go in.
That's great. Thank you, Margaret. Great answer. That's a fantastic example of how to apply something like this. So thank you very much, anonymous attendee. So let's jump on to another. Can machines actually, oh wait, that's in another, maybe I'll just get someone with a name. There's lots of anonymous questions. This one's actually asking, would you consider writing a follow-up joint paper on this topic, expressing the variety of perspectives and your thoughts? So someone, Georgiana Frim, is asking the panelists to get together and write a paper on this. I just wanted to read it out because thanks, Georgiana, that's great. Written word stays and impacts for a long time. This topic's really important to all of us. Oh, that's great, fantastic. And we'll go, Tony Mark has a question for us about fairness. The machine makes logical decisions, but then humans override. Politics, sympathy. Should all humans get the same treatment? Some humans got better treatment. Is this fair? I think this question is one for everyone in society. I don't know if the panelists can handle something that big. Has anybody got any thoughts on it? The machine. Yeah.
Just very quickly to jump in and say that I don't think there is anything that is outside politics. So I think even the claim that there's something that is outside politics is extremely political. So I think this is something we have to live with. And there's no way of bypassing such questions that are political in the sense that they involve some degree of power and power distribution and so forth. Also, with respect to this, I suppose if we could go back to this idea of can we make decisions that are, in fact, the application of a program? I think this is very easy, but is this a decision? And I'm thinking here of something that the French philosopher Jacques Derrida said in terms of decisions, that a decision has to be a radical act, has to be made on the basis of that you don't know what is best. If you know what is best, then you can easily do it, and that's not a decision. A decision is something that involves you taking a path that is kind of like your decision, rather than, okay, here are all the facts. If I follow this, then I reach the logical conclusion. So I think this also helps us maybe think through some of these issues. So of course, we have to think of questions of fairness all the time, but these are not settled questions that we can outsource to a program to make for us. That's the kind of like I suppose, abstract level response to this question.
Great, thank you very much, Eugenia. So I'm going to jump on to the next question. This one is from Owen O'Neill. Thanks, Owen. Traditionally, a job at one of the big tech companies has been the goal for computer science graduates. However, many of us are concerned about these companies' cultures around ethical machine learning. What advice would you give a programmer attempting to work ethically and responsibly? Are the big tech companies redeemable, or should we look elsewhere?
Have to keep it secret, work on it secretly. Don't let them know. Someone else can answer. Maybe am I the only one who's worked at a tech company, or maybe I'm the one to answer them.
I think you might be.
Worked in technology, but not in a tech company, but banking.
Yeah, feel free. Yeah.
I'll brief. I think anyway. All I have to say in this is I think it's a fascinating time, because we have, like so many computer scientists, educated and trained to PhD level, and going into tech companies and demanding and expecting academic freedom. Within that, they have reached that and that will cause this dramatic shift, I think, in tech, and I think it's fascinating and very welcome. And yeah.
Yeah, I would worry if none of the people that have concerns about these things end up in the tech companies anymore, given how much influence they still have. But I would say academia is still a good place to investigate many of these issues. I think, I think so. At some point earlier in the conversation, we said that, well, only the big tech companies can do certain things. And for a few things, that's true. But at the same time, there's still a lot we can do in academia or outside of the tech companies more generally, right? So some things you can do at a smaller scale that maybe you don't need as much data or as much compute for to get a good idea. I think also in the policy world, so that there will be increasingly many opportunities for people who are well trained on these topics outside of the kind of traditional routes for computer scientists. But we still have to kind of establish how exactly that works. And I think that that's an important thing that society will have to do over the next however many years. Because for now, there still aren't enough technically well-trained people in government and many other places, and those pathways don't really exist just yet, and we have to somehow figure out what those are going to be. I also wonder sometimes whether I think some of these issues have appeared because as computer scientists, traditionally, we've been interested in the algorithms, right? And so working as a machine learning researcher, you take some standard data set to test your algorithm, and you don't even really care what the data set is about or whether it's the right data set. The point is that it's a benchmark to compare your technique on, and that's the goal, right? And I think within a certain context that makes sense. But the problem is that then we train all our students in a way that probably kind of reflects the research and less so the broader societal issues. So do we need other kinds of degrees, maybe even at the university level, that really are more interdisciplinary, or maybe there should be a professional degree for being kind of a machine learning developer at some level. Those pathways don't really exist yet, and I think we have to think about what they should be.
It's really interesting, Vincent. Ultimately, Owen is still wondering where he should go, but academia sounds really good, but you just won't get the perks like the giant beanbag or whatever kind of perks that you get in the big tech companies, but it's still a cool place to stay. And we're going to go on to your next question. There has been some interesting discussion about the need to shift our attention in machine learning away from training models using big data sets to using small, well-curated data sets. Do the panel think this is feasible? And can we resist the temptation of big data sets like the common goal?
I don't think having well-curated data sets is mutually exclusive from having big data. And I can give you an example of why. So when we talk about big data, we're often talking about scraping data from the web. And there's a sense that it's just sort of done all over the web or something like that. But you actually see that there are very specific kinds of websites that are largely overrepresented compared to other websites. So Reddit, for example, which tends to be males between 20 and 30 or so, or 18 to 30 or so, makes up a lot of data. And so there's a sense that big data is just sort of neutral, but actually it's making its own sort of internal decisions, or the developer is unintentionally, making these decisions about what needs to go into that big data. But you can actually think about it. You can actually say, I'm going to focus on scraping information from these kinds of places and not scraping information from these kinds of places. So, when you're not thinking about it, those decisions are still there. You're just not keeping in mind the values. Those values are just, or the lack of values just propagating there. But when you're conscious of it, then you can make better decisions about how and where to scrape. And then this also goes to the human in the loop idea, the other kind of human in the loop with the training paradigm, where as you see what the model is picking up, that then informs what further to scrape. And so I think there's, I'm saying this in part because we recently put out a paper on exactly this sort of data set curation thing. And it's, I can't summarize it all here, but basically one of the ideas is that instead of a single developer scraping data, you have a whole team and pipeline that, bases expertise on, social science and things like this about what kinds of things to scrape when. And what time periods. You can be very intentional about data scraping and still have big data, and that doesn't. I guess I'm saying that it doesn't have to be little data in that case. I mean, there's additionally the need for things like filters, and so you want to remove different kinds of things. But just as there's filters on the general big data, there's also specific kinds of queries where you're getting the data in the first place, and we can do a lot better at that.
Great. Anyone else got thoughts on that idea of the small curated data set versus the big sweeping one? Susan, yeah.
As well as our approach to data sets, our approach to AI, I think, will change as well, and it won't be just pattern recognition and big neural networks and machine learning, you know, there's a step change to be had in how we use machine learning. And I point to Alessandra Millo in Insight. She's working on neurosymbolic computation, where there's a symbolic layer that reasons about the patterns. So I'd say there'll be an evolution there that we'll see quite quickly, as well as a totally different approach to training data.
So in a sense, you're providing a layer of machine learning that helps discern the data set that goes into the machine learning model.
Yeah, you can see your patterns, but then there's another layer that reasons and rational and might have ethics and might have, you know, well, you see that pattern, but we don't want to perpetuate that one, you know, that you have
correlation. Yeah, you don't need a machine learning model. Yeah, just basic math over it. Mm-hmm.
Actually, I have a question for Margaret on that one. Are you aware of any work that, so I could imagine that if you have a huge data set that's, you know, scraped somewhat indiscriminately, but you combine that with a well-curated, a smaller data set that's maybe more representative, could you use the two together in like almost a kind of semi-supervised learning sort of way to still make use of the bigger data set, but in a more representative way? You could, for one, you could automate the scraping in some sense.
Like a teacher-student kind of thing. Yeah, that's a really cool idea. I should know about work on that, but I don't. I think there's a lot that could potentially be done there. And that's also not unlike having synthetic data as well. So, you know, there's the small curated thing, and there's also the synthetic thing where, for example, in text, you write out the kinds of sentences that you want, and then you use that to bootstrap further sentences. So, you know, you can do this for having a whole bunch of religions represented, things like that, where you write these sort of out and, you know, use that in your extraction. I haven't done work on that, but I think that's a very cool way to go. Yeah.
And is that a little bit like GPT-3, where you provide a prompt or you give it a guide and then it works away using that guide, or is this something different?
So GPT-3 is it's not giving, it's kind of, I mean, you can say it's guidance, but you can think of it basically as probabilistic. So if you give it a prompt, the generation from there is going to be based on what's most likely based on that prompt. So it's not reasoning about what you've told it, it's finding, it has found and will then produce the words and constructions that are most likely to follow those prompts. So I think that's not quite the same, because in that case it's already been learned. There is maybe an extension, or maybe what you mean, where you produce data from GPT-3 based on prompts, and then that becomes the data you train on, something like that. So
interesting.
Yeah, I thought maybe that's like, if you really want to have positive training data, maybe you give GPT-3 a ton of different kinds of positive prompts, and then that's the training data.
Okay, yeah.
Right. Yeah, if we had some carefully curated text, right? That's what GPT-3 is based on, an enormous amount of text. If you somehow put that next to some curated text and use that to kind of bias GPT-3 towards maybe not outputting certain types of things, that would be kind of the analog. And I'm pretty sure that's not what GPT-3 is currently doing, but in principle, maybe you could do something like that.
Let's write a paper on it.
And it's very seductive to think these systems like GPT-3 are reasoning, when you said it's just probabilistic. It's easy to fall into that trap, I think, or maybe it's just, as a non-expert, think there's some amount of reasoning going on. But anyway, we could talk about this all evening. It's really interesting. Now I'm going to go on to the next question, because we need to wrap up fairly soon. We've got a little bit of time. So this one's really good. Can machines actually measure the risks to human lives while making decisions? This talks to the whole moral machines expert or experiment from MIT, and Vincent had talked about how does, in a split decision, that this driverless car will go, okay, the risk of the person driving versus the risk of the person crossing the road, and then, oh, it's a homeless person, it's not a homeless person, it's a cat, it's a person, it's a, you know, but so how can machines actually measure risks, I suppose, in real time is what this question's asking, to human life?
Yeah, so that's, so maybe there are two components to risk, right? One is how bad the outcome is, and one is kind of the probabilities of certain events happening. And in principle, the second component of what the probabilities are of certain events happening, you might imagine that an AI system could be much better at that than human beings, right? If you imagine that, you know, some company produces self-driving cars that drive everywhere in the United States, or maybe even more broadly in the world, they would get a lot of statistical data that would tell them that, well, if the car in such and such situation takes this action, this is how likely it is that there will be a collision. That is actually the kind of thing that I would be inclined to leave to machines rather than to human beings, because, you know, we're not necessarily that good at probabilistic reasoning, and we don't have certainly access to such an enormous amount of data. The harder part is assessing how bad relatively those different outcomes are, right? AI today doesn't have the broad understanding of the world that we as human beings have. And so like, when we talk about the homeless person in the MIT Moral Machine, you know, no AI system today really has any real understanding of what that means to be a homeless person, right? So we can't rely on today's algorithms to make that kind of assessment and trade-off. You could try to learn it from people, so that's been kind of our approach, but it's non-trivial to do so because people have all kinds of biases. If you know, there was this effect in the Moral Machine study that apparently the homeless person got hit by the car much more often, and I would venture that probably most of the people that made those decisions as a matter of principle wouldn't want to do that, right? But they just have this, so it's not that they explicitly want to run over the homeless person, but somehow implicitly that's what they tend to do. So it's difficult to get out of people what it is that they really want done, right? And because the way you ask the question tends to affect them a lot. So there are a lot of behavioral components that we know we've been struggling with in our work. That if you change something about the setup that really shouldn't matter from the perspective of how we value the outcomes, people are going to give different answers. That's what we see in the behavioral sciences. And so how do you avoid that? How do you, you know, and can you avoid it in some way that we really get at some level what people really want? Those are difficult questions that really go into the cognitive sciences, maybe more than just traditional computer science.
Thanks, Vincent. And anyone else from the panel, have you any thoughts on measuring risk to human life? Or will we jump to the next question? Okay, let's go to the next one. So this one's from actually Georgiana, who mentioned wanting a paper from this, but Georgiana Ifram asks, panels of humans seem to make better joint decisions, like a jury, for example. Should we use panels or ensembles of systems to reduce the noise in decisions, with some requirement that each individual system would explain the recommended decision? That's interesting.
Ensemble methods are common. And so I think there's sometimes when we talk about AI, we think about it as one algorithm or one model. But part of why it's good to say like AI system is because a lot of it is an output of a few things that are then averaged, or you can use sort of different ways of ensembling them. You can learn weights for them. But that is actually a common method. It's a good idea.
Can I come in on this one? I think this is a very interesting question that's got my imagination racing in terms of what I was going back to about data. And so assuming there's no such thing as objective data, really, that everything, there's a perspective and it embodies a philosophy or a standpoint. And it's an interesting one in terms of ethics. So there is no universal ethics. Like each of one of us would have there's differences in our perhaps ethics or moral judgments or what we would do in a particular instance. So you may move away totally from creating a system that is objective and chasing objectivity and neutrality and being bias free, if we kind of know that's maybe not really beyond, we can't be bias free ourselves. Or do we create different approaches to ethics and morals and these judgments and make panels, because what makes groups better decisions from groups is diversity. So can you have can you embody that, replicate that diversity of approach in different AI systems, but from a moral and ethical perspective? Yeah, anyway, interesting.
Yeah, can I just also come in on this, because to me this is a fascinating, I suppose, dilemma, because of course you can have like this kind of diversity involved, but we also have like all the social psychological issues of like groupthink, conformity, tensions that have to be resolved, and all that. So I don't know if we're like, what's the term now, going from like the frying pan into the whatever, like I can't think from the frying pan into the fire, or vice versa. But it is fascinating to try and figure out a way of like incorporating this kind of thought that is a little bit different to ensemble, the way I understand it, at least, Margaret, because that is more like I don't know, it's not an averaging, but it's more like the outcome of a deliberation. So it's slightly a different way of approaching it, but I think it's a very interesting thing to try and think through.
And that's interesting you should mention with groupthink. So I suppose it would have to be where you don't get groupthink, where it's the wisdom of the crowd, but making sure that the crowd is comprised of individuals who aren't being influenced by other individuals in the crowd, so that you get a kind of consensus.
You can actually do morality-based decisions just at the end based on the output. So I guess also this is to Susan's earlier point that in economics, there's social choice theory, where you're like you can think of like the cake cutting problem, if you guys are familiar with this, like how to allocate things. And those same ideas can be applied in final decisions of what kind of output to use, so or how to do the training. So do we prioritize, for example, the subgroup that has the best performance? So are we trying to make the model have the best performance for the most at-risk populations? Or are we trying to make the model work best overall? Or are we trying to make the model work best for some sort of average, something like this? And this sort of goes to social choice theory, like Minimax, Nash. These are mathematical kind of approximations of these different moral decisions. So even just sort of at the end points, you can incorporate those sort of things in good ways. Yeah.
There is a whole computational social choice community, which actually is meeting right now. They have its biennial workshop this week. I think maybe it's already over at this time, but anybody interested in that exists, or feel free to reach out to me about that too.
Cheers, thanks, Vincent. And we're going to go to another question now. Some great ones so far. So this one's from Yanis Stavrakakis, and he says, hi to all, and a big thank you to the panelists. I'd like to ask the panel about the political economy of AI. Who should be responsible for the development of AI and its underlying values that could potentially make decisions for humans? Private companies have a profit incentive, whereas AI could potentially envelop public goods and many other aspects of human life, such as health and education. Are we looking to a future AI that is implemented by big corporate interests? So anybody that wants to jump in there with that, yeah.
Yeah, this is what I was trying to allude to in the beginning. Absolutely, I'm very, very concerned by this, and I'm very concerned that the kind of like the impetus, the momentum for AI development is with these companies. I understand, of course, that universities and also government funded or research funding that comes from public sources is invested in this, but really, I think it's of huge concern to me that these kinds of developments are to some extent in the hands of private corporations. And also to speak to this question that was raised before about should a young computer science or an early career computer scientist choose an academic career or an industry career? I think that can this choice even be made? Like, I mean, we offer in Ireland to a postdoc in computer science, something like 40,000 euro per year. A company offers 3 times this amount. Someone comes out of their studies having to pay student debt. What are they going to choose? They'd be crazy to choose an academic career. In academia, we would offer them maybe like a 12-month contract, maybe something after this, maybe nothing. So all these feed into like what is getting developed, how it's getting developed, who develops it. I think this is very far from being a level playing field where companies are on a par with academia, with government. I think that companies at the moment, and given the whole kind of like neoliberal kind of like structuring of the public sector in recent years, I think companies have a lot more power than either academics or governments have at this point. And this is of huge concern to me, and I don't want it to be like that. I see that there is like scope for private enterprise, but I don't think they should be driving developments.
Anyone else want to jump in on that big question?
Yeah, I would say if you draw an analogy, if you draw an analogy to economics and finance, there, of course, there's much more regulatory infrastructure, and there are kind of, serious public institutions that maybe they don't pay quite as much as going into industry, but you can certainly have a career there. I think that doesn't quite exist yet on the AI algorithms side. And maybe there's a space for that. I think maybe even some of the companies would be happy to see some of these things clarified a little bit more, and have some rules to play by. Margaret is saying no. Well, in any case, it may be a good thing. But yeah, so I think that needs to be developed in some form or other. But we're pretty far away from that, I would say. Still, there's some gradual progress, right? Like in the EU, and but we're not at the level of sophistication that you would have, for example, on the finance side.
Yeah. I mean, my answer to sort of this in the tech industry is, I think, maybe predictably depressing and pessimistic, where internally at Google, me and my co-lead were working on essentially how to self-regulate. I mean, that's sort of an aspect of our work. So when you have regulation from outside, that runs the risk of stifling innovation or actually putting in constraints that achieve the opposite of what's desired because of the disconnect between how training and development works on the ground and then how it's sort of understood in government. So that's a huge problem. And so one way to ideally address that would be to mix top-down governmental regulation with self-regulation that sort of meets some of those goals. But what we've seen now happen at Google is that the 2 people making the most progress on this were not only fired, but fired like fantastically in the news with insults to both of them. And, it arguably is because we wrote a pretty harmless paper with due diligence on language models. And so, we were operating with the assumption increasingly that we could help with this, from a real like ethical based standpoint. But that experiment has now shown itself to have failed in a massive way. And so while I was really hopeful for this back in October, my mind has really changed on the ability of tech companies, to have any sort of real due diligence, self-regulation over ethical issues.
Thank you very much for that. It's great. We've obviously, so it's great to hear your points on that. And unfortunately, as it's 3 minutes left, we've no more time for any more questions. But thank you very much to all these who submitted their really interesting questions, and thank you so much to the panelists for giving us your time and for giving us your expertise as well. Thank you, Brian, for running everything smoothly in the background. And also, I just want to give a final thank you to Charity, Alupo, and Patrick from McEnroe, because they've done so much work as co-organisers in the background. You don't see them here at all, but I'm sure they're listening in. So thank you, everyone. It's been a fantastic event. And will I hand you over to Brian to say a final little goodbye, maybe?
Yeah, I'll just echo all of that and say thanks a million to you, Marie. That was great moderating. You really kept the discussion moving along there and covered an enormous amount of ground. And then I guess just on behalf of our centre to thank the panelists for giving up a lot of time and a fascinating discussion. I know a lot of our PhD candidates are in the audience and they'll have gotten a huge amount from this, plus all of the other attendees. So I'll just finish by saying thank you so much, everybody. If anybody does want to follow up, please do.
Awesome.
Thank you. That was really enjoyable. Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Great.
Thanks, everyone. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone. Bye.